Welcome to episode number 4 of the Common Questions podcast series. My name is Jonathan Cheka, and I'm joined here today by Miss Emily Harmon. Emily, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Emily, tell us a little bit about your life growing up. What was a young Emily Harmon like?
A young Emily Harmon was very quiet, always singing and creating a lot of things, just very interested in exploring and learning, but also, young Emily was very afraid of a lot of things too. So as I was growing up, that always colored all of the experiences I had and all the things that I did because I was just so nervous all the time. I've told a lot of people before that I was one of the most uptight kids I've ever met in my life. I've met a few since then who kind of beat me, but for the most part,
Someone's broken your record out there.
Someone has broken the record, but for the most part, I kind of there was an unparalleled anxiety that I experienced in a lot of my life growing up. So that was something that I definitely struggled with. And one of the reasons why I was grateful that I had a big church background, because we were in church all the time, multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. And I had a lot of people in my family. Everywhere I looked, church leadership usually was related to me in various ways, whether it was pastors or teachers or other kinds of leaders or that kind of thing. So that was a strong heritage that I had. And I came to faith pretty early on. So that was something else that was true of me as I was a Christian starting, I think I was 4. I may have been 5 already. It's a little blurry. It's hard to just remember exactly where you were in the timeline when you're that young. But I think I was 4 whenever I decided to follow Jesus. And that was something that definitely helped me through all of my years growing up with all of the anxiety and nervousness and things that I felt. So that was something that I was grateful for because I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't have been a Christian throughout all of that time.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And I know just personally, you're a bit of a reader. I'd say that's fair.
Yes, I was always reading when I was growing up as well. That's part of, my desire to learn more and to just, I wanted, and I still have this desire somewhat, but it's been tempered a little bit. I want to know everything. So,
that's simple.
Yeah, very simple.
So top 3 books when you were growing up, what were your go-to books?
When I was much younger, The Wizard of Oz was a big one for me. Read that book a lot. I was also very much a fan of Anne of Green Gables, that whole series. I've read the first one the most, but that whole series is something I was interested in. When I got older, Harry Potter became the thing that kind of eclipsed all others in my world.
Yep, that became the thing.
It became the thing for a lot of people, but I was one of them.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Very cool. Well, moving on to today's topic. Today we are talking about the Incarnation and just asking, what is the Incarnation? What do we do about it? What is the significance of it? It's a pretty churchy sounding term, incarnation. Mm-hmm. So let's just start out with a broad overview. What does that word mean, incarnation?
Yeah, so that word incarnation, if you try to just, at least for a moment, disentangle some of the theological implications of that and look at it in a little less of a churchy kind of a way, incarnation indicates becoming flesh or being embodied in flesh, taking on flesh. So if you have any sort of spiritual entity that takes on flesh, that's what we call incarnation. And so when we do think about it in some more church-specific theological kinds of terms, very often when we say that, we are referring to the incarnation of Jesus because God took on flesh, and which is very important. And we need to understand what that means. We're going to talk about that today as part of what we're going to get into with all of the things that we're going to discuss. But it's also important, I think, for us to recognize that we as humans are also incarnated. If we want to talk about incarnation, to understand it fully, we have to understand that incarnation applies to us too. That's something that we experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And since you briefly mentioned it there, just to give a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk a little bit about a definition of incarnation, which we kind of just did. Why is it significant? Why does it matter for us historically? How has the church understood this? And then I think most importantly, what do we actually do about it? Because if we have a bunch of knowledge but don't do anything with it, then there's no function to having that knowledge in the first place. But having said all that, if people walk away with just one thing after this podcast, what is that one thing that you want them to walk away with?
I think the one thing that I would hope that everybody would walk away with is that our faith as Christians is incomplete. It's insufficient if we don't understand who we are as humans, and if we don't understand that Jesus was a human. If Jesus had not come to the earth, had not been incarnated, then we don't have any faith. So I think that's the one thing that I would take away, is like the importance of incarnation to the foundations of our faith. You take that away and we don't have anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes a pretty good lead into talking about the significance of the thing itself. So I'll start it off a little bit and then hit the ball back over to you. But the fact that Jesus was the perfect, the ideal human being, that he was what humanity was supposed to be, and that he still came in physical form, I think has a lot of significance for how we view physical things and physical creation around us. Because I think we can get into kind of a false dichotomy and Paul especially talks about sin as the flesh so many times, that we can get this false dichotomy of the spiritual is good and the flesh is bad, and what we need is just to be less physical and more spiritual. But then Jesus coming in physical form really does a lot to counteract that. What would you add on to that or expand on it?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's one of the instances where our vocabulary can fail us, where we don't have the right kinds of words to fully understand and comprehend those things. Flesh can refer to our physical bodies, which we shouldn't understand as being evil in and of themselves. We don't need to separate ourselves from our bodies. That's not an ideal that we have. But then we also know that there are things that we struggle with as humans here on the earth because we are fallen. So flesh takes on this negative connotation in that sense. But just thinking more about that, I do think it's really important for us to look at Scripture and see all of the instances in which we can tell that our physical natures are affirmed, that God planned for us to live this way as embodied creatures. And one of the best examples, as you mentioned, was Jesus is the perfect example of that. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for us to understand the incarnation of Christ and why that's essential to our faith, because we see that God cared so much about what he had created, about humans, and that means our spiritual and our physical together. Like he designed us to live that way, that he humbled himself to come to the earth in order to make a way for us to be saved and be brought back into a proper relationship with him. If the flesh was something, if our bodies, our physical nature was something that we should be pushing away or should be shying away from, then it wouldn't have made any sense for Jesus to be a human here on the earth. He would have directed us in ways that we could separate ourselves. Like you need to find ways to live above your physical nature or do any of those things. So understanding that is really key to us understanding ourselves and who God is.
Yeah, and I think probably an important distinction to throw in here, just in case people aren't steeped in the Christian terminology anymore, is that while obviously creation was initially made physical, like that is the original Garden of Eden type stuff, but there is a corruption that has set in since then. So while we're saying that the physical can be good and that this is how God has designed it, it's not always in the way that it was designed to be. There is the effects of sin and death and corruption out there. Is there anything you would add on to about that?
About corruption? Yeah, I think that is important for us when we're looking kind of at a more eternal scale beyond just what we see here. One of the things that we know that we can expect is that in the end, when God decides that it's time for us to move into eternity, move into the next experience that we're going to have, the entire earth and heaven and everything that's been created is going to be recreated. And that includes us. And we're going to be resurrected, anybody who has died at that point. And so we will we'll have this physical existence, and we will have things around us that are physical and created. But right now, we're only experiencing just a part of what that is going to look like because of the corruption of sin and death in the world around us. So that's something that we wrestle with every day. We're fighting with those things. But one day that is going to be different for us. We are going to have perfected, glorified bodies. And then the creation around us will also be perfected and stained by the effects of sin and death in the world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that is a good reminder about the time scale that we're looking at. It's not just about the here and the now, but about what will be and what will always be. So, and when we were getting ready to record this episode, we were batting around a couple of different ideas of what to talk about. And you brought up contrasting Christianity and the view that it has of physical creation with other religions. What would you say about that?
Yeah. So I'm definitely not a scholar in other religions. I've done a lot of reading just because I want to know everything. But I haven't achieved that yet, and I know that I won't achieve all that. But there is this idea that you find in a lot of other worldviews and religions, as you were kind of mentioning earlier, of there being this dichotomy between our spiritual and our physical natures, and the teaching that you can commonly find in other ideologies is that the spiritual should be elevated above the physical should be diminished. And in some cases, ultimately, the physical needs to be kind of discarded. And that is what we are looking forward to, what we're trying to achieve in the life that we have here, is being able to transcend the physical that we have. That's definitely a core idea in Buddhist thought and Buddhist teaching, is that you are trying to get to a place where you are letting go of all the physical things around here. An attachment to the physical is a sign that you've not made it yet, that you've not arrived. There's also a lot of those kinds of separations in Gnostic ideas. I'm trying to find this prizing the spiritual, doing a lot to punish your flesh because your flesh is bad. And so you have to bring it into submission. And if we could live without bodies, that would be better, just those kinds of ideas. And even a lot of that, in my experience, has also crept into a lot of Christian thinking, people in the church thinking that that's what we're looking for, is that one day we are going to move on from this life and then live this disembodied spiritual existence with God in heaven. So on this different plane, wherever that is, and we're just going to be these spirits that float around. I don't know. Nobody really has a way of conceiving what that would look like, but I think it's just an understanding. Because the reason why that's been my impression, I've heard from other people, but also when I was a kid, that was kind of what I thought would come like after this life. It's like at some point, we're not going to be fighting with this flesh anymore that we have. And what that meant was that we're not going to have a body, that when we go to heaven, heaven is just going to be all spirit, all spiritual.
We're all just orbs of light floating around.
Yes, orbs of light or something floating around in the space idea that I had of heaven. So I think that is something we have to guard against, is not allowing these ideas that you do see communicated in other religions and other ideologies become just kind of enmeshed in our own understanding of what God has said to us, making sure that we are staying grounded in Scripture and what is communicated there, not being syncretistic in that kind of sense. So.
Yeah, and jumping a little bit ahead to the application part, just because you mentioned the view that we have of what we're doing here and now is affected by what we think will come later. So if we think that the spiritual is good, the physical is bad, then it's going to lead to a significant devaluing of the good physical creation that God has made here. One of my professors, he did this hand punching thing every time he did it. So that's the visual that's with me. But he's like,
punch,
yeah, exactly. He was talking about when God created everything in the beginning and he declared that it was good. But not only that, but it was very good. And it was always with that little, like punching your hand
Uh-huh.
into the palm of your other hand. That's
Uh-huh.
old Professor Wilson. But I think it's good to keep in mind because it does affect how we live in the here and the now. If I think that God has created the beauty of nature for us to be able to enjoy, I'm going to act a lot differently to preserve that
Mm-hmm.
than if I think, well, I'm just trying to get to the end here and what the physical creation is like doesn't really matter. I mean, stewardship is just to get me to the end goal. So whatever I have to do to get there is fine. But when you understand that God has created that to be good, and not only that, but very
Very
good,
good. Emphasis.
emphasis, yes, punching for emphasis. And then it's going to affect how you live on a day-to-day
Mm-hmm.
basis and how you make those choices. And you talked a little bit about the Gnostic aspect there of, again, spiritual good, physical bad, transitioning a little bit into the historical interpretation of what the incarnation means. I think the Gospel of John implicitly talks about it a
Mm-hmm.
lot with what they'll usually call proto-Gnosticism. Not quite full-blown Gnosticism, because that probably came around mid-second century or
Mm-hmm.
something like
Mm-hmm.
that, but kind of like an early version of it. But then I think, and this was a little bit later, but very explicitly combated in the work of a guy called Athanasius. Do you want to talk about On the Incarnation by Athanasius a little bit?
Sure. I definitely, that's one of the kind of just down through history, one of the quintessential works when we're talking about incarnation, and still very well. They're just like, it's when you read it, communicates very clearly. And it's just interesting to read. Basically, what Athanasius does in the way his argument flows is he puts forward a number of pairings to bring his argument forward, all emphasizing why Jesus had to be incarnated or why our faith can't be understood outside of that understanding. So he talks a lot about creator and creation. So that's one of the pairings that he has where these things are joined together. And so he's talking about the relevance of them, and that's being a foundational thing in there. And goodness and grace also is something else that he talks a lot about, is how those things work together. And we see them on display through the incarnation of Jesus. He also puts forward some contrasting things as well, and talks about some of the problems that we've seen over history and ideals that we should be striving for. So he contrasts the image of God also with the image that we have as humans here in our corrupted state, and then how Jesus provides a way for us to be restored to the image that God intended for us to have whenever he created us. And also talks a lot about corruptibility and incorruptibility, contrasting those things. We live in a state now where we are corrupted, but Jesus provides a way for us to live in eternity as incorrupted human beings with bodies working through all of that. So his ultimate argument is just that this is what incarnation is, and this is why this matters. And here's how we've seen this play out through history, and how we're going to see it play out in the eternal state in the future.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone out there is interested in reading that book, it was written probably about, mid-300s, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you can find a good modern translation, it's very readable.
It's very readable,
And
absolutely.
there are some good modern translations out there if you want to get a little bit more historical perspective on the Christian faith. There's actually a version that C.S. Lewis wrote an introduction to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he talked about in there that I think I've brought this up before, but he was a big advocate of people reading old books, because when you read just new books, you're reading books written by people who, on the most fundamental level, share in your worldview and in your time period and the age that you're caught up in. But when you go back to something like the mid-300s, that is just a radically different time, a radically different worldview. So we can benefit in a way that we can't from new books when we go back to those older books. And obviously that's not to say that it's superior or equal source to the Bible. Obviously that's
Right.
the most authoritative source that we have. But I think we can also get interesting perspectives from these other works as well.
Absolutely. I see reading old works or any work that's not from your time that you're living in, as a kind of intercultural studies, because their culture is different because it's at a different place, even if it's in kind of the same geographical area or the same kind of cultural heritage. There may be some commonalities, but there are some fundamental differences that we're not going to know because we're not a part of that culture in that time. So even thinking about reading things that we are modern to us because they're in our time, when they do come from different cultures, there are things we can pick up from there and learn and understand. So same kind of thing with reading historical works. Yeah.
And just one more joke to close out that section. In C.S. Lewis's introduction, he talks about how older books are obviously very helpful for getting this different worldview, and future books would be just as good, but they're a lot harder to get a hold of.
They are, unfortunately.
We're still working on solving that problem. See what we can do. We'll have it sorted out for y'all by next week.
Yes, easily.
So moving on to application, what do we do about this with the incarnation? What are just some things that come off the top of your head? I know we've talked about a few already about how we view nature and creation and who human beings are intended to be, but what are just some simple, practical ways for us to be able to apply this information to our lives?
For sure. I think the first thing that I just want to make sure that we are emphasizing and pausing over is that we should be taking care of the world around us, because there is value in the world around us, and it's important for us to be. That's kind of what God intended whenever He was creating humans, put us in the garden. He said, you need to tend and care for this, and this is your responsibility, and I'm giving this to you as a gift for you to be a steward of. And so that is still true today, for us to be good stewards of the things that we have around us. But also to narrow our focus to just the human part of creation, we should take care of ourselves. That should be part of our concern, and we should build it into our regular routines to do things that are taking care of our bodies. We need to take care of ourselves spiritually, but we also have to take care of ourselves physically. And we do, because of our reality now and kind of the way we're living. We know that we are ultimately fighting against this corruption that we're living in, and we're not going to be able to do anything to take care of ourselves so perfectly that we wouldn't struggle, we wouldn't have physical things going on. But we need to do what we can to be taking care of and protecting our physical selves, and then doing that for obviously other people around as well. We want to watch out for other people and do what we can to take care of them holistically as spiritual and physical beings. Something else that I think is just important to remember in a practical way how we're applying these things is understanding. It should be like a foundational part of our Christian experience that we are understanding that Jesus actually was here as a person, that we, even though He's not walking among us right now and none of us have seen Him physically, that was the thing that did happen. And so that can't be something that we overlook in our faith and how we're understanding the things that God has given to us. Just off the top of my head, those are a few things that I think of.
And something else that we were talking about in kind of the prep meeting, it's a little bit outside of what we've been talking about, but backing up to the fact that Jesus came not only in physical form, but through, for lack of a better term, natural means. He was born of a woman. That means that Jesus was a kid at one point. Jesus was an infant. Jesus was a toddler. Jesus was an elementary school aged kid. So I think that also has some implications for how we view raising our children, that God in flesh was a child at one point. So when we understand that, viewing children as full people in and of themselves, as just as made in God's image as all the rest of us full-grown adults. Maybe the fact that I'm bringing it up shows some shortcoming in my view of children and how I think about them. Maybe no one else struggles with this, but to understand that these kids are just as made in God's image as we are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it is important to remember that children are people too. They are just as much human as you and I are human. And they are in a stage where they are obviously not as developed as other people who live in the world. But that's one of the reasons why we have to do what we can to take care of them and to teach them and to help them to grow, because they are valuable humans. And we can't have a lesser view of the kids that are in the world around us. They are less important they matter less. And none of that is true. Every one of them is just as valuable as every other person who lives in the world.
Mm-hmm. And not to quote Jesus or anything, but he did say that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those such as these, to have that childlike faith. And there's all sorts of implications for that as well. But I do think it's very important to understand that Jesus grew up, and that has some serious implications for how we raise our kids or view other people's kids and how we treat them. So that's just an interesting note that I think we hit on a little bit. As we're coming to a close here for the episode, bringing back around to the one thing that we want people to take away, do you mind just stating that one more time?
Yeah. So we need to remember that we don't have a faith if we don't have the incarnation of Jesus. That is foundational to everything that we believe and how we understand how our relationship with God is because of the incarnation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it may not have been on the incarnation, it might have been another book, but some ancient church father, his big quote was, "What is assumed cannot be healed," or "What is not assumed cannot be healed." It's going to bother me now that I can't remember who that quote is from, but to understand that Jesus became incarnate, came in the flesh, so that our physical bodies could be redeemed and saved from the corruption that we're in. That is the foundation of the Christian faith, and what really separated it from its Judaic, is that a word? The adjective of Judaism? I don't know. Probably going to edit that part out. But that was the big break, is that God came here in flesh to save our not only our physical bodies, our spiritual being as well. But that was a thing that took so much getting over, was that physical embodiment of God.
And it's a distinctive from other teachings and ideologies, is that God did come in flesh for that reason. You don't see in other ideologies and teachings. You see sacrifice of deities in some different religions and ideologies and thought, but you don't see God himself coming and making a sacrifice for everyone in the world. That's just not something that you come across.
I think that is a pretty good place to call it a day. Emily, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
And that was our final episode of this release of the Common Questions podcast series. Hopefully we'll be able to do more of these in the future. And if you have any questions that you would like for us to cover in a future episode, feel free to use the Q&A feature on Spotify. You should be able to find below this episode. And I just want to remind you guys one more time about the Common Questions video series that we have available on YouTube. A link will be in the description below to all of those. If you want to see any of the other resources that our church, the Experience Community Church, has made available, you can go to experiencecc.com or download the Experience Community app onto your phone. If you have any other questions or anything that we can help with, feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you guys and what you thought about this series. And I just want to say thanks for listening to all of these. I hope they've been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed them, and hopefully we'll have more for you in the future. If you do want to make sure that you get notifications about future releases, because we don't really have a regular release schedule right now, you can turn on notifications for whatever platform that you're listening on, find out about the next episodes that drop whenever that happens. Thanks again for listening, and hope you have a great day.